This episode is sponsored by Magic Mind and Wix Studio.
When is the last time you listened to a podcast about web development, web design, and small business and didn't fall asleep? Yes, we cover web development, web design, and small business, but like actual human beings with personalities. If you're a beginner, we're not going to talk over your head. It's more like asking your buddy for help. We have guests, we have fun, and let me tell you, these two can get off on a tangent. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to HTML All the Things Podcast. This is Matt Lawrence and Mike Curran.
That's right, everybody. We are back, and this is the HTML All the Things Podcast. This is a big-time part two. This is part two of the toughest concepts in web development. So we're going to be talking about, of course, the toughest concepts of web development. We had so much to talk about in our previous episode. There was even a point in which I almost needed a towel because I was sweating because we were freaking out about something. So we're going to kick it off in a couple minutes here with responsive design, and then we're going to go into other things such as server-side rendering, dependency management, continuous integration, otherwise known as CI, and much, much more. So if this sounds interesting to you and you want to support the show, you can go check us out on that Patreon, leave a review or rating on your podcast app, join us in our Discord server, or share this with your friends. And then, Mike, I have a small tech-related thing I'm going to bring up to you right now because it drove me nuts for an entire evening. Could barely find any information on it. Found the information on it, was sad, and now I want to talk about it. And it is, so I have two computers. I have a desktop, and I also have a laptop. Both are new, and new within like a couple of years. And I went on to my laptop, specifically my work laptop, and it updated. And suddenly Copilot was no longer, meaning Windows Copilot, or whatever you want to call it, Microsoft Copilot, was no longer found in the bottom right corner where I had put it. It was in the middle with the other apps on my taskbar. Now, this has happened before. You just kind of go in and tell it, go back to that right-hand side, and there it goes. And how I used to use Copilot is I would usually just press Win-C, which is the hotkey, the keyboard shortcut, and I would just have it kind of pop up, and it was always sort of docked on the right-hand side, and I could quickly ask it questions, and it felt very much like it was a part of the system. This time, however, I go digging for the settings, and I cannot find them, and I'm like, what the heck's going on here? So I keep looking it up, and all I'm finding are guides from back when it moved to the center the first time months ago, where everyone's like, just go here, change the setting, it'll be fine. And then I find a forum post, and this is from some sort of official Microsoft moderator or an employee or something in, I believe it was the TechNet support forum, something like that, where they said that the Copilot Plus PCs, which is sort of like their own ecosystem, they're the ARM or ARM processors, the Copilot Plus PCs have had it this way for months, and that it's not going back into the corner, and that it's not accessible via Win-C anymore. And in fact, it's not accessible by a keyboard shortcut at all. And basically what's happened is Copilot is now just an app. You click it and it opens an app. And I think that's, I hate that. I haven't used Copilot in a little bit because I've been working with ChatGPT, and that's how ChatGPT works. But ChatGPT, because it works this way, because it just opens in a web app, in my case, because I have a Windows, I don't have a native app installed. I have it installed from Edge as like a PWA or as like an app, and it just opens and it feels very third party. But like Copilot always felt so integral or so integrated into the system because it was right there, Win-C, it opens up, and you could even set it, and this is how I had it set, where, it'll open up on the right side. Let's say it's like 200 pixels wide. It'll actually just shrink your screen down width-wise by 200 pixels. It'll shove stuff out of the way. You can have it be an overlay or shove stuff, and I had it always shove stuff so that I could quickly work and just always have it open, and it would automatically resize my windows. And those days are gone. Those days are gone, and I think it's weird. I have a very small other thing to say about this. It's really weird because my desktop does not have that update. This is a brand new desktop. I've updated repeatedly, and my desktop still has it in the bottom right corner. I've noticed that my Copilot still says preview, and as a part of this forum post from the Microsoft person, they said that, as Copilot has matured out of preview, which is basically like their beta or early access mode, it has gone into this like, hey, we're just going to be an app now. I think that's lame. I think that's a lame way to have it. I think that's a lame place to put it. And one of the pieces of evidence I have for that to sort of argue my case is that when you are in different apps, such as OneNote, as an example, there's a Copilot button in there. Now, I don't have Copilot Premium, so I can't test that button. It's disabled. However, I would assume it just opens up right inside of the actual app to help you. This is the same way that it works when you're using Copilot in Microsoft Edge, their browser as well. And so it feels like, hey, we have these apps, and if we want Copilot to work in them, we should have them integrated. But Windows itself, you could kind of think about it as an app. And I would like my very proprietary, Microsoft-made AI assistant to be always available. And yes, Copilot Plus PCs do have a Copilot button. It has taken the place, I believe, in most, if not all cases. Don't quote me on that. It's been a while since I've seen them. But the Copilot button has taken the place of the second start button, which is on the right-hand side. I'm sure there's different keyboard layouts that are different than that, but those are some of the ones that I have seen. So yes, you could say, well, Matt, why don't you just go get yourself a Copilot button? Well, I want my Copilot to integrate with the system in some way. That's my rant. That's my little side thing. And it does it in Android, like Android, not Copilot, but Android Gemini or Google Gemini, I guess, is like very much an integral part of the system. When you on my phone, when you do a gesture on the screen, it pops up on the bottom and it's like an overlay over top of whatever you're doing. So it feels like it's built into the system. Like this AI assistant is ready for you. It is not this little siloed app. Mike, what are your thoughts?
I don't use Copilot on Windows. I just realized that it is in the middle for me. So I guess I got that update. I don't care because I could see like, I tried it once because you were mentioning it and I put like, hey, start a focus mode session. And it's like, hey, here, I can start a focus mode session for you, which I thought was pretty cool. But I can do that with Windows search in less buttons. So I don't think I'm the target audience for a Copilot integration into Windows because I know what I'm doing with Windows for the most part. I think people that don't know what they're doing and it having integration with settings is really cool because you can talk to a computer in natural language and have it do setting things. I don't think it can do all setting things either yet. But overall, I think like it eventually getting there, awesome. Should it be integrated more deeply into the computer? Maybe for that use case, again, making it more like a first party, kind of like an overlay rather than an app makes sense in that situation in my mind. I just don't care because like, again, ChatGPT is better in most ways for my AI purposes. So I wouldn't use Copilot for ChatGPT things. I use a bunch of AI tools in my IDE like SuperMaven. Obviously, Copilot wouldn't do anything like that. I wouldn't code with Copilot like in terms of like the Windows Copilot, not GitHub Copilot. So I don't like I just it's not my cup of tea yet. So maybe that was a mistake on their part, but on the other hand, like I don't know I don't think a lot of people are using it. I think they're scrambling a little bit because of the amount of money they've invested into it, and their usage stats are probably showing really poor results. So now they're like, well, we can move it into the center. Maybe people will use it more. Like some marketing person is trying to fix stuff. And the reality is that like people just don't probably use it as much as they expected them to. Because there's so many other AI tools and people don't even use AI tools. Like I asked my dad recently, hey, have you tried ChatGPT? He's like, what's that? So that's the thing. Like, I think they're trying different things to try to penetrate the market a little bit better. And maybe it's a mistake, but it's going to be tough for them to course correct with the amount of money they have invested and the amount of integration they want to have AI into their system, considering like
I think the thing with Copilot too is I haven't like watched all the commercials or anything like that for Copilot, but just as a general sort of note on the tech world is this might be me looking into the past with rose-colored glasses, so this might be completely debunked and nonsense. But to me, I feel like phones, computers, laptops, desktop, whatever, all that tech stuff used to have better commercials showing you what it did in real world situations. Now it's just like a quick little like, you want a recipe? You can ask Copilot. You want to do this? You can ask Copilot. And it's sort of like, yeah, but I already do recipes. I already do this. I already do that. Whereas before, it would show somebody like running building to building in a frantic way, being like a startup, entrepreneur. And then, we're talking about in the past, they pull out their BlackBerry and their BlackBerry saves the day because they sent an email, this and that. And there's going to be people out there in the entrepreneurial world that are like, holy crap, like, at least, especially back then, I would like email in my pocket. And so then they're going to buy that. Whereas right now, I feel like they're just sort of saying like, Copilot can do this, Copilot can do that, Copilot can do this, Copilot can do that. And it's not very much like, hey, we're better at doing this, or like you really should use Copilot instead of a different method for this. Like, how many people are getting their recipes off of Pinterest? A heck of a lot, right? How many people that have been using Pinterest for 5 years, 10 years, whatever, how many people that have been using Pinterest for that for years are going to be like, I'm just going to ask Copilot now? It's going to be a hard sell. So they're kind of just showing these redundant things. I feel like we need to start showing some like really intricate use cases and not have intricate commercials for them. Like, these would be niche things that they quickly film, that they quickly show, they probably get from the community, right? Like, get a YouTuber to say why they use Copilot, and not just in an ad way. Like, why do you use Copilot? How do you use it? Just before this show, I was talking to Mike. I said, I've gone to ChatGPT, and here's the thing. So I play video games. I'll watch a video game guide, and you have to keep pausing the video to figure out like what weapons, what stats, what this, what that. It's a pain sometimes, especially if it's complex, right? So what I'll do is I'll go to ChatGPT, and this does not work. I will give it the link and say, yo, watch this and list out, what weapons I need, list out the stats I need, and it won't work. I'll give it to Copilot and be like, yo, in this video, this is like a guide. I want you to tell me what weapons I need and where to get them. It'll be like, okay. And it'll do it. Like, it'll find the weapons, and with pretty good accuracy too. Not perfect, but pretty good accuracy. That's something that you could get from like a gamer, and show that stuff in short form content to then say, hey, you watch video game guides, this is something you could do it for. And assuredly, you could more than likely use this thing for more than just video game guides. You could use it for other things like, hey, I watched a guide on like what's the best keyboard, but there were 15 keyboards in this list. Which one was number 1 through 5? List them out for me and where are their product pages. And then Copilot comes out and does it. So to me, it's just like, I feel like we're just not showing things as well anymore. I feel like we think, oh, people are tech savvy, they know what's going on, but it's like, they do know what's going on. That's why you have to convince them to break what they've been doing so they do it differently. That's my 2 cents. Maybe I'm a fool, but that's me.
Yeah, no, I think you have a good points there. Like, I think that we are not doing a good job at explaining AI, and I think the main reason for that is just it can do too much. So just narrowing down what it can do and advertising that is becoming difficult, and advertising in general is changing. I don't know. There's a lot. Could be a whole episode topic, honestly, and maybe it will be in the future. But I agree, Copilot, weird decision to remove it as an integration to OS and make it an app. Completely agree with that. Having said that, let's get right into the toughest concept of web development, part 2. So part 1, we just finished talking about cross-browser compatibility. We talked about a bunch of other things. Like, there's a lot of complexity in web development, right? And I said this in part 1, but I'll kind of reiterate a little bit in part 2. Web development is kind of looked down upon as like an easier path to go when you're getting into programming. But the reality is that in some cases, yes, it is easier having, instant builds. The no compiler can actually be a benefit in the development stages when you're constantly iterating on things, and not having to compile code is really fast. But the reality is that a lot of that also a lot of what web development can be really complex because of how much it touches. Like, you think about it, web development nowadays, everyone talks about full stack. And so you have to be essentially a server administrator that knows security perfectly, that knows databases perfectly, and a completely front-end developer that maybe even understands how to build UIs, design UIs in Figma, everything in between as well. And this is where the complexity and the toughest concepts come in, right? So the first concept I want to talk about here is responsive design. So responsive design, why is it hard? Well, there is a million different ways, or infinite, I should say, your website can be viewed out there by someone using a device, right? They can be viewed on desktop computers. They can be viewed on laptop computers. They can be viewed on phones. They can be viewed in landscape or like portrait orientation. They can be viewed on a freaking refrigerator at this point. They can be viewed like on a watch. Like, the amount of different ways that someone can interact with your website is at this point pretty much infinite. And because of that, designing something and actually laying it out so that it can take and be accessible to the most amount of people possible. And I say most because I don't think you can cover all, right? Like, I think it's almost impossible to be able to design something perfectly for a widescreen computer and a watch. There's going to be something in between that is not going to work. Like the watch might not work, or like, something in between might not work. So you have to draw a line at some point. So you have to, make sure that 99% of your users, or 98%, whatever you want to choose, can access a good version of your website. And then hope that the other 2% can at least use the functionality in some sort of way, or be able to access a device that can access the better version of your website. And there's a lot of different ways we can handle this in web development, obviously. Like CSS media queries are probably number one. And then there's also like checking what device it is and serving different kinds of style sheets based on the device. Back in the day, it was really popular to have like a completely separate mobile version of the website, like mobile.whatever.url.com or m.whatever.url.com, and serve that instead of the desktop version of your website. We've gone away from that in the past decade, because almost everyone uses a phone now. So a lot of this like mobile first development has started to come in, where you first design for a phone and then you kind of extrapolate that and make it a little bit better on the desktop. There's a lot of different challenges in this. Like, what can you use to make it easier, right? Like what tools actually make it easier nowadays? Well, you can argue that with the development of CSS Grid and Flexbox, it's gotten a little bit easier, because both those tools can allow you almost infinite customizability of how stuff is displayed beside each other, on top of each other. And it's quite easy to like target different screen sizes, again, with that CSS media queries, and like flip, for instance, a column layout into a top to bottom stacked layout, right? It's pretty simple to do that. And that's very common. You can follow like typical design trends online. Like instead of, coming up with a completely brand new design, a lot of times people will look at their competitors, or people will look at different templates and try to copy that design, because those designs have already accounted for all of these different challenges that I've been talking about. You can use kind of frameworks that solve this for you. Bootstrap, Tailwind, CSS, they help a lot with that. There's many different ways you can tackle it, but at the end of the day, it's one of those things where you really need to pay attention and do a lot of testing. Because if you don't, go into your dev tools on Chrome or whatever browser you're using and try to, go left and right on the responsive view, it's going to be a problem. Like you're going to miss some view, and someone won't be able to log into your website, and that could,
I think the thing with responsive
money.
design as well is that as you sort of develop a product and it gets like further and further along, there's a lot of elements on the page. Oftentimes, like we will rarely in projects delete things from pages. Oftentimes we add things onto pages. And so when your product matures in this way, some places will have like sort of a minimalistic policy, and so they will kind of constantly be fighting over what should be on the page and then delete some stuff, and that makes responsive design easier. But when you don't have that in place, what you really do experience is you're kind of like that, what's like the spinning plates, where like you have the spinning plates and you're constantly like kind of juggling, like, whoa, keep this one spinning, this one spinning, this one spinning. You're trying to keep this heading from not collapsing. Oh, now we have a heading that's super long. Okay, that's making this too tall. Oh, hang on though. Now this image that was supposed to be clipped isn't actually clipped. It's the full. Okay, so we have to change the overflow. Oh, hang on. Someone changed the paragraph length. Now we have stuff being cut off when it shouldn't be. Oh, the call to action is not being pushed down like it should. Or maybe something's encroaching on its space and there's not a padding. Okay, we got to fix that. And so you have a lot of these sort of edge cases that you would never even think of. And it starts coming from all ends. So it not only comes from the different devices, like Mike was saying, where, you're looking at stuff on, anything from a watch through a VR headset, right? And everything in between. But you're also start looking at things from, or you also start considering things from the other end, meaning literally from people editing the site. Like if somebody goes in here and puts a 1,000 character heading, is that acceptable? And if it is not, then maybe you're going to have to go into your CMS and limit that. Now that's more sort of technical and not design, but it very much affects the design, because if you only account for, say, 60 characters and suddenly someone puts in 100 or 1,000, what's going to happen to your design? Is the heading going to look really, really bizarre? Like, is it going to go full width and break the images? Like what is going to happen, right? And so you have to kind of decide on how rigid or how like sort of like liberal or free, kind of free form do you want your editors to, how much control you want them to have because people will go in and think, okay, you know what? I'm just going to add 3-4 words here. Well, what if it's a really big heading and it adds another line? What if you have your font of a really big heading set to 100 pixels? So now it's 100 pixels taller, but your entire wrapper div around the entire thing is set to overflow clip. And now an image that was below it with, like, let's say, like a call to action, like you're supposed to click the image for some reason. What if that thing gets pushed out of the way or gets pushed to be too small and you can't quite see what the image is? Now it's going to be like, like what's going on? Is this broken? And it's like, no, it's not really broken. It's the fact that it's a case that we've never considered. And the thing I just laid out there with the heading is pretty simplistic. It's a pretty simple fix. You either, swap the heading or you change the overflow or you change the height. But there's a lot of intricacies in designs. Like bentos are really famous, or like I would say infamous, for just being problematic, right? They look like they're super simple, but then all of a sudden it's like, well, hang on, one bento is 3/4 of the width. One bento is, let's just go into thirds. So one bento is 2/3, another bento is 1/3. Now we have, that's one row. But then the next row, something's 100% width. And it's like, okay, are we dynamically allowing, like, say, something like a flex box to grow and shrink? Are we dynamically placing like a grid? So we have like a really rigid bento structure. How about responsivity? So you have it looking real great and on one screen, like on desktop, but then you shrink it down and all the bentos, like 2/3, 1/3 of the width, those don't make sense anymore. Everything's got to be 100% of the width in order for you to read the content. So now you have to have that. Okay, well, is it wrapping properly? Like bentos are really kind of one of those things that are very common and can get really, really complex. And one of my favorite things to work on to learn responsivity is similar to a bento, just in structure, and that is a nav bar. A nav bar, especially with drop downs, is very similar in that it's a tool that always needs to be there. It's in various modes, so it can be sticky, it can be not sticky, it could be on the left side and full height. It could be across the top. It could just be a navicon. It could be all the way across, but then on mobile, it becomes just a navicon. And then how do those drop downs work? How do they work on mobile? Like there's so many little things you need to look at, similar to how a bento works, not looks, but works, that a nav bar is something that I love to practice on. And I really like, and I always encourage people to like, hey, go build yourself like a really complex nav bar. Whether or not you're going to use it or not, it gives you insight into, oh shoot, like, is this all going to be HTML, CSS? Do I need a bit of JavaScript in here? And to me, a nav bar is a prime example of the complexities that sort of modern responsive web development and layouts. It's kind of like the perfect example because it's so common and it's so complex, and it's just a great place to practice.
100%. Those are really good things. You should probably put links to that in the show notes, by the way, Matt. I think people will appreciate that. Okay, so next one here, and this is a big one, web accessibility. So I think this one gets on the back burner for almost everyone, and that's really unfortunate because a big percentage, or enough percentage of people, have trouble using devices, whether it be physically able to actually click a mouse because they have issues with their hands or whatever, or they can't see very well and stuff like that. There's enough of a percentage of a population that this affects many, many millions of people. And because of that, by building sites that are not accessible, you are essentially removing a significant portion of people from ever using your website. And that's both unfair from the user's perspective because they can't use whatever you've created, and unfair to your client or your boss or yourself if you're building this for yourself, because you're essentially eliminating a source of income if this is something that you're trying to build for profit, right? So you need to take accessibility fairly seriously, and it has to be more of a first party thing when you're building or when you're deciding on frameworks to build with, right? That's one of the things that I'm going to be suggesting for what makes it easier. But why is it hard? Well, essentially a website in itself without any thoughts of accessibility is just a bunch of text and images. And that in itself can be very confusing to navigate for instance, a screen reader. If you just have a bunch of divs on a page with a bunch of text, how will someone know? How will a screen reader know what's the heading? How will a screen reader know what's a button if you're just, using on clicks without using the button HTML element? How will a screen reader know what's the article? How will a screen reader know what the heck's going on? It'll just be a bunch of text and a bunch of images, and no one will know what's going on. So when it's reading it out to someone, you just to put yourself in their perspective, they're hearing your website, and you can actually run a screen reader yourself to see how your website sounds. You'll see the issues right away. Like if you're using divs instead of buttons, it'll just say, here or something, whatever your button label is or whatever your button div is. And it won't necessarily tell someone to click it. And in fact, it won't be clickable, because if you don't assign a specific ARIA attribute, if you don't assign a tab index to a div, a person won't be able to even navigate to that button, right? If they're just using a screen reader. So there's a lot of issues with that. And that's just from the screen reader perspective. We're not talking about any other thing that could go wrong on a website. Again, like you should be able to talk to your site, and it all comes down to really screen readers. The other benefit of accessibility is that it can make your site a little bit easier to read for Google. So again, a little bit easier to scrape for Google to be able to understand what's there. So there's a lot of benefits to it. I like to talk about the accessibility benefits outside of the benefits to the actual target group, because I feel like that just doesn't land enough. And this is not a great thing, right? Like I don't want to say like, hey, you should just build it for like, I want to be able to say you should just build it for the small group of people, the group of people that need this tool, right? And have that be all you need for someone to build. But the reality is that's not enough. What you can do is try to sell them on the benefit, and there is a significant benefit to web accessibility on themselves, right? I'm trying to pull on their selfish strings to try to make the web more accessible. I think that's the right way to go. I think that's the only way that it really works. So again, to build a better accessible website, it will benefit yourself, not just the group of people that need it to actually view your website. How to make it a little bit easier on yourself? Well, the great thing is that frameworks like React, frameworks like Svelte will kind of push for accessibility natively. They'll give you errors if you're not using the right button labels. They'll give you errors if you're trying to put a button, click on a button. They'll tell you what you're doing wrong. And then on top of that, you can use UI libraries like ShadCN. I talk about ShadCN all the time, that have accessibility built into all of their components. So for instance, if you want to create a custom select menu, a lot of people do because the select menu is very limited, right? The drop-down select menu. When you create a custom one, you lose all the accessibility of the built-in select HTML form element. But what libraries like ShadCN do is they will build on top of those accessibility input elements, put a facade on top of that, and then also add all of the accessibility on top of the facade. So it'll act like a native element, but you'll be able to customize it as much as you want. And then it works across the board for any of their components. So I'm a huge proponent of these libraries because number one, it makes building easier. Like just conforming to a style guide is much easier with these really, really well-designed custom components, right? That you can customize as much as you want. And second of all, it gives you accessibility out of the box. And that's really the key here, is that you need to be able to promote accessibility, you need to have it work easily. Because I know for a fact, no one goes in and writes ARIA labels until they're forced to do it. And no one goes in and will create these tab indexes until they're forced to do it. And so it just doesn't get done. If you use tools like ShadCN, like Svelte or React, it's going to help you get to accessibility much faster. You can always check your accessibility score using stuff like Lighthouse or PageSpeed Insights. And another tool that I really like, and we actually had the creator on the podcast early on, probably in our first 2 years, I think, Polypane, Killian's tool. That tool is killer for accessibility checking and accessibility like tweaking and stuff like that. They have so many tools. He has so many tools in that development browser to help you with responsive design, by the way. Responsive design is the number one thing that it helps with, but also accessibility and performance. So huge fan of it. Let's put a link to that as well in the show notes because Polypane deserves a lot of credit.
One thing I was going to say too is that what's good about accessibility these days is that it's starting to become more sort of on the radar of people. Like when we were starting to learn web development, I never really heard about accessibility unless I specifically went and looked for it. And then it was like, oh, hey, like, why isn't your site accessible? And it's like, whoa, like, I didn't even think about that, right? It's like, I'm just learning how to code. I'm just learning CSS. I'm just learning HTML. I'm just learning JavaScript here. my plate is full. I didn't even think about the accessibility angle. And so there are tools out there where like something like Webflow will, Webflow obfuscates a lot of web development away from you, but it still has an accessibility checker, and it'll let you know like, hey, for SEO reasons, these headings should be correct, but also like that does help screen readers. Things like, hey, this button doesn't have descriptive text. This link doesn't have descriptive text. And there's obviously more warnings than just that. But those are sort of the ones that are super easy, even if you're trying to be sort of accessibility conscious. It's so easy to just accidentally forget, right? You're not even thinking, and all of a sudden you're like, hey, hang on, what the heck's going on here? Why isn't this working? Or why isn't this like accessible? And it's like, oh shoot, like to me, having a return to top button with an arrow, that's a super common one that I always forget. Super common, little arrow there, but like a screen reader just sees an arrow and it just says like, this is an icon. Like, what is this? And adding like a proper label saying this is return to top is really important, whether it's in text or whether it's, in an ARIA attribute. Those are the little things that these apps now, like Webflow, will see and let you know. And many people that use Webflow, because it can be used in various degrees of, development, whether you're a developer or not. If you're not a developer, you don't understand all this web accessibility stuff. And so it's good to see that there are tools like Polypane, like the Webflow sort of auditing software, and many, many others. It's good to see that this is more in the forefront, even if the tool itself is supposed to be obfuscating development away from you. Web accessibility feels closer to sort of a piece of the puzzle now, rather than something that you like add on like a DLC later, right? It feels very much like, hey, when you make this website, at the very least, it should be, accessibility conscious, and it should be as accessible as possible. Whereas before it was sort of like, cool, that website looks great. Oh, hey, we're starting to get complaints that, it's not accessible. Should we fix that up, right? And then you tack it on. It's like an add-on to what you've already done. So it's starting to become more of that core process. But something that is a part of my core process on the daily lately, or not even on the daily. So I've been super, super busy. I've been talking about this, last few weeks. I've been golfing a bunch, been working a bunch, and now the holiday season is starting to come into effect. People are asking, weeks in advance, can you do this on this weekend? Can you do that on this weekend? And I'm thinking to myself, man, 2024 is coming to a close, and that's not good because I'm running out of weekends and running out of golf season, running out of weekends. But as I navigate this busy time, I'm doing so in a sort of responsible, calm manner, and I'm doing that with Magic Mind. So instead of abusing coffee like I once did, I am now taking this nice little productivity, mental performance shot, you might even say, every time I need to run out there and golf early in the morning. Every time I need to run around on a weekend where I'm going to 2 or 3 different events in a single weekend, I'm grabbing Magic Mind, I'm having them with me. If we're going away for the weekend, if I go away for the weekend with my girlfriend, I'm bringing a couple Magic Minds for us, because I know there's going to be a time where it's like, we set this time aside to chill in the hotel room because we're in between events. However, we are wherever we are. Let's go be a tourist. Let's go do something. But we're tired. Let's have a quick Magic Mind, and let's hit the town. Let's run around. Let's do whatever. Let's stay up late, wake up early. And this stuff, Magic Mind, does help me get through that. And I'd like to highlight some of the ingredients of Magic Mind. I'd just like to go through it. So I actually have a Magic Mind right in my hand. I have one of the productivity shots right in my hand here. And I'm going to read the top 3 ingredients here. This is right from the label. Organic matcha green tea, which is broken down here as filtered water. Organic ceremonial grade matcha. So that sounds good. Organic agave. Hopefully I'm saying that correctly. And passion fruit. Again, there's more ingredients. Those are just the top 3, but that sounds good to me. If you notice, it's not absolutely packed to the brim with sugar. There is some sugar in here. It is subtly sweet, but it's not packed to the brim with sugar. It's not packed to the brim with caffeine. You're not going to get that caffeine crash. You're not going to have all these problems. You're not going to be like, oh my God, I'm going to hit that caffeine crash at 3 p.m. Do I have a coffee? But then is that going to affect my sleep? And then I'm going to have more coffee in the morning, and it becomes a real big mess. Hopefully, something like Magic Mind will be able to help you get through that. And if you want some help with your energy levels, you want some help, calming down, but staying productive during this very, very quickly approaching holiday season, year-end season, whatever it is that you would like to call it, we have a very, very special offer for 10 of our listeners. That's right, 10 of our listeners. What we have is actually a 40% deal And I'm going to pull this up so I can just read this verbatim to you so that I don't make any mistakes. So this is only available for the first 10 uses, okay? This is a 40% discount, right? So you use our code HTML pod 40, that's all caps, no spaces, no hyphens, no nonsense. And you use that code with this link, magicmind.com/HTML pod 40. Again, HTML pod 40 on the link, magicmind.com/HTML pod 40. And you can get up to 40% off your subscription. Remember, do this quickly. If you're listening to this and you're like, I wouldn't mind having some good energy levels as we go into what is arguably the busiest season of the year, get on it. There's only 10 of these available. This code can only be used 10 times. HTML pod 40, that link, that code will be in the show description as well as in the show notes on htmlallthethings.com. And now let's go back to the difficult world of web development with Mike Curran.
Okay, difficult world of web development continued. Server-side rendering and static site generation. Yeah, this one definitely hits. I got super confused with this stuff. There's also client-side rendering, which isn't added here, but like I should add that, and I will actually add client-side rendering. So all of these different types of site rendering make web development more complicated than it needs to be, especially when you're trying to learn it from a theoretical standpoint. The reality is, you probably won't need all of these right away. You probably don't even need to learn about this immediately until you actually need one of these, right? There is a use case for each one, and I'll go into that a little bit right now. But there is an important indicator that, hey, don't put too much pressure on yourself to understand all the nomenclature in web development. Otherwise, it will bring you down. And that I've tried to get that through on a lot of podcast episodes, because if you overwhelm yourself from the beginning, it's going to make it hard for you to continue building your skills. But having said that, the complexity comes through with these new meta frameworks that have been coming around, right? So initially we had stuff like Angular and React, which are more client-side rendered frameworks. No one even talked about client-side rendering at that time. Everyone was kind of just assuming that, hey, these are like single-page applications. That's what they are. And that was fine. That made sense at the time, where everything was kind of being offloaded on the client to be able to render it quickly and show you all the information in real time as you're clicking through the application. Everything was really snappy. With these meta frameworks like Next, SvelteKit that came in, that kind of built on top of these client-side frameworks, what they added was the ability to server-side render your framework application, and also static generate your framework application, right? So now you can have the kind of the benefits of old school with what PHP was doing back in the day and how WordPress works for the most part, right? And new school with these really dynamic, really powerful client frameworks, all smushed together into one, and do whatever you want on any of these, like any page, essentially. You can have one page be server-side rendered, one page be client-side rendered, one page be static generated. Like you could combine these into this hybrid. I don't want to say disaster, because there are real use cases for hybrid, like making a hybrid site. But the reality is, from an architectural perspective, it becomes very complex. And that's where, again, why it's hard. Like understanding, if you go into a site and all of a sudden you're seeing, okay, this page is client-side rendered, this page is statically like server rendered. And I'll explain that in a sec. Client rendered, again, means it's rendered on the computer's browser. So you're sending information like a JavaScript payload and a bunch of text, and the JavaScript payload will take the information and then actually render, like create all the divs on the page when it loads on someone's computer, right? The divs aren't being sent from the server. It's just JavaScript and a bunch of information that's sent from the server, like a JSON payload. Server-side rendered means that the page is being dynamically created on the server. When someone navigates to your page, the server will dynamically create the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and send you just those three files with actual semantic HTML, CSS that your client will immediately see. So your client won't have to dynamically create the page. It'll be dynamically created on the server, okay? And then static site generation is when you can build a site, like literally build, and instead of being dynamically created on the server, it actually is dynamically created on your deployment. And so your entire site is created into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript right on deploy. And then when you access the site, it's immediate. Like you won't have to wait for a rendering to happen. It'll immediately respond with the payload of HTML and CSS that your browser can immediately show. So all of these things have their use cases. And right, so a client-side app, that's really good for like a web app, like a Linear or a to-do list or something like that. A server-side rendered app is really good if you're worrying about like a blog with SEO requirements so that Google can see that, hey, this site's not only client-side rendered, it actually has like regular HTML and CSS. Google typically prefers that. It also can make a difference for the user where they get a fully loaded page on load rather than like, those gray boxes that vibrate or whatever, like the loaders all over the page. That's usually for client-side rendering. And then static sites are really good if you want really, really quick loads and you have stuff that doesn't change very often. You don't have many dynamic features on your site. So all of them have use cases, but that again contributes to the complexity of the site of web development because of the fact that they're useful, but they're also complicated to kind of combine and use together. What makes it easier is going through it and only using the default levels of a framework until you need to reach for something specific, right? So if a framework like SvelteKit is server-side rendered initially, use that. Don't worry about what's server-side rendered, what's statically rendered, what's client-side rendered at that point. Just use it, and then you'll get to a point where, hey, I need this to be more interactive. And you'll be like, oh, maybe I can just make this component client-side rendered, and then you'll look it up. And the framework, usually with inside its documentation, it'll have some really good examples on what those things are. And it will make a lot more sense to you when you actually need it. Rather than looking at it from just a theory perspective, you're going to be looking at it from a very practical perspective, and it's going to make it click. I always worry when people just dive into the theory with this stuff because it is complicated. And until you have that aha moment on why you need it, it's almost like it's a little bit useless. It's nice to know that it exists from that perspective, but I wouldn't dive deep into it until you need it.
I think this is, absolutely a perfect candidate for like what you've been saying, which is like, if you get super into this before you actually need it, it's going to start confusing you. And for me, it's like, I'll try to understand this. I'll do some reading up on it. And then I'll be like, cool, I understand it. And then I won't use it for months. And then I'll be like, what is that again? And I'll have to relearn it. And so it's just kind of useless, at least from my perspective, without actually needing to put it into practice, without like quite literally practicing it on an app, on a website. And so I'll just constantly be forgetful of what these different things are and why I need to use them. And so I would almost say that you need to bump up against a use case where it's like, hey, something's not loading correctly. Something's really slow on older devices. Something is, enter in problem here. How do I solve that? Someone will then, whether it's ChatGPT or Stack Overflow or whatever, will then say, well, have you tried, removing it from some client-side rendering and trying rendering on the server side, or whatever the case may be for your particular use case? Then you go, oh, what's that about? Then you can start kind of putting that into practice. It's good to know the theory behind some of this stuff and understand what these things are generally, but having little experience in web development or having little experience in these various sort of methods of web development, like static site generation, things like that. If you're not going to have any experience in it and you don't have any experience in it, it just really kind of isn't useful for you at the moment. Devs, this one's for you. I've got 30 seconds to tell you about Wix Studio, the web platform for agencies and enterprises. So here are a few things you can do in 30 seconds or less on Studio. Integrate, extend, and write custom scripts in a VS Code-based IDE. Leverage zero setup dev, test, and production environments. Ship faster with an AI code assistant. And work with Wix headless APIs on any tech stack. Time's up, but the list keeps going. Step into Wix Studio and see for yourself. Link in the show description and in the show notes. Like, I've been doing a lot of work in a lot of like no-code tools right now, just because that's where our clients are. Like, that's where our tickets are coming in effectively. And to me, it's like, I don't need to worry about this stuff. Like, whether or not the tool is doing static site generation, like it's irrelevant. But we just had a space on X in the pre-show where we were talking about, some projects that we were just brainstorming a list of projects that we may want to be doing in public, build in public. And maybe some of this stuff is going to come into play. Like maybe static site generation makes sense. Oh, wait, no, it has to be more interactive. Okay. maybe like server side. Well, hang on, we have an online or an online problem where things need to be more offline. Okay, maybe it needs to be client side rendered. Okay, well, where are these assets coming from? There's a lot of different ways to sort of think about this and handle this, and so to me, it's like when or if we jump into that project, that build-in public project, that's going to be where potentially I'll bump into one of these and I'll have to do it, right? I'll have to like learn it and figure it out, and that's to me the better way to handle it.
Yeah, I think that's just, unless you're like a theory-driven person, like again, my learning style is going to be different from someone else's. I'm a practical-driven person, so theory will only get me so far. I need to have that like hands-on understanding of why I need something, because like I've run into an issue and then I can reach for it. And some people maybe not, but I always recommend my own approach because I hope it resonates with people that need it. Next one here, event-driven architectures. So I'll be honest with this one. This one was just on a few lists that I was looking at. I don't have tons of experience with event-driven architectures. I haven't really designed a lot of real-time applications, but real-time applications really use this a ton. So I wanted to put it on here. So I'm going to go through this one really quick and jump to the next one. But overall, what we're talking about here is like, if you're using something that requires constant connection to a server, right? If you're using like something that requires WebSockets, like a chat application or something where you need to create a link between two users that can constantly connect back and forth, maybe WebRTC between users, like a live video chat. That's something that could use event-driven architecture. And typically, the very limited experience I have with WebSockets, that stuff can get really complicated really quickly. Having something be available on an instantaneous level between two devices running through a server is complicated. There are patterns to follow to do this properly, but scaling that can be also really difficult. Like, what if you have 100 users trying to interact with 100 users at the same time? Could be a lot of conflicts there, and there could be a lot of server architecture that you actually need to do before you can get to that level of scale. Overall, I would highly recommend, if you need this, right? If you need something that's extremely real time, that relies on consistent events between two machines, go in and actually learn that path, right? Event-driven architectures. Like I said before with the server-side rendering stuff, this is something you'll obviously hit when you'll know that there's a something not working, and you'll probably want to learn more about it. And that's what I would recommend. There's not really much like what makes this easier. Again, this is one of those things where you just need to get your hands dirty, learn stuff like Redis for caching, learn Kafka for messaging queues, stuff like that. There's different kind of architectures that you can use to make this easier. And there's a lot of patterns out there that you can follow. That's the great thing about this, is that you want to learn design patterns and then follow them when you're unaware of how this works. And that, in this particular case, if I was asked to create a real-time messaging system right now, I would be going and looking up how others created a real-time messaging system, figuring out what they did, what event-driven architecture is, and following that pattern. And then once I got comfortable with it, I could go in and start optimizing things that are more kind of particular to my use
I've
case.
never actually had to deal with these, so like I don't have any really specific comments, but it's very similar to my sentiments on the previous. The SSR, SSG, and the client-side rendering is just like more of a question of like, okay, like when am I going to use this, right? Like if I'm going to make an instant messaging application just for fun to like, mess around with it, then sure, I can kind of dive into this stuff. But this is almost like, you're starting to reach a point where this is a difficult thing, but it's all difficult because you're trying to get instantaneous things where like the web wasn't originally designed to do that. Like people when they first were building websites weren't like, let's instant message each other. Like that wasn't really in the ticket. Like, I mean, Ajax, was like revolutionary, where it was like, oh my God, we can do things without, submit forms and stuff like that without refreshing the page. Like that was kind of as real time as it got, or as it gets for a lot of websites. If you can even call that real time, which I don't really, probably not. But, if you need to jump into this stuff, jump into this stuff. But I mean, I've been in the field for years and I've never had to, so that's it.
It's a very specific thing. Like you might need it, you might not need it, who knows. Next thing here would be dependency management. This one is pretty big. I think a lot of people have issues with this and maybe dive too deep or not deep. So with dependency management, what we're talking about here is stuff like NPM and Yarn, right? Stuff like maybe a package manager, maybe even a build tool like Vite, combining all of the different packages, libraries that you need for your app to run, making it easy for you to then install those, make sure that you can import them properly into your different files, and have it so that it actually works in a reasonable way. The complexity is that a lot of these dependencies have their own dependencies. And so you're not just importing a dependency, like when you're npm installing a package, a lot of times you're npm installing a package, which then also npm installs 10 different packages, which each of those 10 different packages can have even more packages. So just managing the dependency tree that's created there requires tools, requires you to really rely and almost like hope that tools like npm, yarn, pnpm will solve that issue for you. And when there's an issue with one of your dependencies that can trickle down 10 different levels, that's really difficult to debug. Like when you have dependency version management issues where like you've updated your Svelte, but a dependency that you uses an older version of Svelte to use something, and that has been deprecated now. All of a sudden, your application stops working because of a dependency of a dependency of a dependency. And now you're going through and figuring out what dependency actually broke this. It can take hours. I've been there. It's not something that happens very often. And it's not something that happens if you kind of really pay attention to your update schedule. Like a lot of times if something works, it works for me. And all I do is I check for security vulnerabilities and I don't update unless there is a security vulnerability. With a lot of these front-end packages, it's very unlikely to have any security vulnerabilities because it's already in the front end, unless you're using something on the server, which is a little bit different. So those things you need to kind of pay more attention to for updating on a consistent basis, similar to like a WordPress plugin. You want to make sure those are up to date as much as you can. But my suggestion here is try to use the minimal amount of dependencies as you possibly can. Now, way easier said than done because there's so many things that make it 10 times easier for you to build something. And a lot of times you use a framework, it already comes with like 100 different dependencies. So you're kind of screwed there, right? And second of all, I don't even know. I hesitate to say like audit your dependencies because that in itself is like a whole different skill set. Like going through and figuring out your dependency tree and figuring out what dependencies of dependencies are there can be.
I was going to say it starts
hole.
The chain, right?
Yes.
Like it's like this dependency relies on this dependency, and then these are both relying on package A, but this one needs package A1, and this one needs package A version 2, and it's like and then like
one actionable suggestion I have is a lot of these package managers have ways to lock down what versions dependencies of dependencies use. So for instance, if you have that situation that I had where a dependency of a dependency has a version mismatch with the main framework that you're using, you can actually like from the package.json file lock down so that only this version of a dependency can be used. And then that usually solves a lot of those issues. So if you learn like from a very basic level how to lock down dependency versioning, that will help you troubleshoot a lot of these little dependency mismatch issues, which is mostly what causes the confusion and mostly what causes issues. Everything else in dependencies is handled very well by these tools. So you can kind of rely on them as much as you can. And yeah, if you just figure out how to lock down dependencies, I think that's like 99% of every issue that I've ever had, which is already quite a few. I mean, not a lot. Only a few issues.
Thankfully, I don't deal with really that many dependencies, short of it just being like, we're installing stuff, and I go, cool. And I haven't had to really dive too much into dependencies. So, I mean, short of, I guess you could call them dependencies, but having sort of like some WordPress conflicts of different plugins trying to pull from different, whether they have like dependencies behind the scenes, which I'm sure they do, or if they have like conflicting dependencies, or if like one WordPress plugin will conflict with another, things like that. That's kind of as far as I get. So I guess you could say that the site, which is WordPress in this case, relies on those plugins. Then I have a little bit of experience with this type of stuff, but not from sort of like an NPM or yarn perspective for sure.
Exactly. So the next thing here and the last one on the list is continuous integration and continuous deployment. And I'll loop in just deployment of web applications in general as well, because that can get quite complex. essentially with the evolution of your tools, so with the evolution of these frameworks, there had to be a way for you to easily deploy them, or some way for you to easily deploy them, because it becomes really difficult to have this deployment pipeline. Imagine you have your, framework, Svelte, let's say, and you need to get it to the point where it's accessible for someone else to visit on the web, like a regular website. So what you would need to do is you would need to code in Svelte, then you would need to build it into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files, which the Svelte provides you with the tools to do that. And then you would essentially take those built files and then transfer them to like a shared hosting or a VPS of some sort that has Apache or Nginx on it, link to those files, and you're mostly good to go, right? Like that's the most basic pipeline you can have with a very simple framework, right? But in that pipeline, in the Svelte sense, a lot of what you're doing is going to be client-side rendered. That's how Svelte works. Where the complexity came in is, how are you going to do that with dynamic server-side rendering? How are you going to do that with dynamic data fetching? How are you going to do that with incremental server-side rendering? The stuff we were talking about before. And in reality, unless you build tools around it yourself, there was nothing there until meta frameworks came about. And the complexity with meta frameworks is you can't just build and deploy them the same way that I just mentioned. You have to have this kind of intermediary step or intermediary service that can serve both the server side stuff like Node.js and the client side stuff, and have that kind of work together so that you enable stuff like server side rendering and API endpoints and stuff like that. And you can do that in multiple different ways. You can have a Docker container that kind of bundles everything together and deploy that to a regular VPS server. That is easier said than done. There's examples out there. There's templates for you. It's not impossible, but it's definitely something that is a little bit of a higher level of server infrastructure knowledge than just pointing a bunch of HTML and CSS files and JavaScript files onto a server via FTP. Or you can have kind of a pipeline, which is what I'm talking about here, continuous integration pipeline, where let's say it hooks into your GitHub repo. And anytime you do a push to a branch of some sort, maybe it's main, maybe it's dev, whatever, it will automatically run a set of tools, stuff like GitHub Actions, Jenkins, or maybe even Vercel, right? Like a deployment tool, where it will build your application, put it onto the right servers for you automatically, and then generate your SSL certificate and give you the link. So that's the pipeline that you can either build yourself with tools like GitHub Actions or Jenkins, or use a service, which is what I would kind of say it makes it a little bit easier for you, like Vercel, Netlify, CircleCI, stuff like that, that will give you those pipelines already pre-done and automatically kind of connecting to your GitHub account and handle the deployment aspect and the server aspect for you for a price. Obviously, there's free tiers, but essentially these meta frameworks have created a very big business of managed servers and pipelines that allow these companies to make a lot of money. And there's really good reason for that, because it can get very complicated to run, serve, and scale these applications.
Well, this is like CI is something too that I think is really scary when you first get started looking at it too. Because when you think about CI, when you think about CD, just from a complete beginner perspective, and you're just kind of starting to learn it, it's pretty terrifying to say, hey, you know what? We're just going to continuously integrate and deploy this. And you're like, yeah, but what if I make a mistake, right? What if a developer makes a mistake? What do you mean by we're going to constantly push out builds? What do you mean by we're going to constantly integrate together and things like that? And so once again, we're kind of getting into that niche once again, where it's you need to sort of get into this stuff. And we're starting to bump up against stuff that isn't web developer responsibility. It can be, absolutely, and it is for many people, but this is starting to touch on, hey, do we get our sysadmin, do we get our DevOps guy to do this? And the setup of a CI/CD pipeline would normally be done not by the developer. Normally it would be done by a server admin or a DevOps person. However, sometimes this stuff does fall to the web developer. And I would say that CI/CD, I don't know if you agree or disagree with this, Mike, but I would say CI/CD is kind of the end of the road. Like, this is as far as you should go into server stuff as you like. In an ideal situation, this is as far as you should go into server stuff as a web developer. Yes, I know that the world is not ideal. We don't live in a utopia where we have, server admins growing on trees and we can quickly just like reach out and get them when there's a problem, or when you want CI/CD, or when you want to like set up some hosting and stuff like this. But this is just one of these things where it's like, in my opinion, the developer has enough on their plate. There's enough to learn, enough frameworks and packages. And we've talked about this, right? Like, this is part 2 of difficult web tech. And I would say like CI/CD to me is the end of the line, where it's starting to become like, okay, we need a DevOps person. If CI/CD is really, really important to us and our setup is complex and extremely, extremely important, it's time to get someone to help, right? Because like you're mentioning Docker, you're managing infrastructure here. It's like, okay, now we're continuously deploying onto what? Oh, can the developer just handle, the servers, like the live servers, the web server, the, whatever else is there. And it's sort of like, okay, so now we're developing and we're managing and we're administering and we're checking logs. Oh, but we're not doing that. So then now the site might crash and no one's looking at logs, right? Whereas something like a no-code tool would obfuscate all this type of stuff, right? It like, you don't get the logs, like they do. And if they go down, or if your site goes down, you call them, right? It like obfuscates this level to you. So to me, I think that, it's good to mention this, and it's especially good to mention CI/CD at the end of the episode. Because to me, again, correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, I think this is the end of the road. Like, if you got to do everything and it's super, super critical, I mean, that's cool that you can do it and everything else. And I know some places require it, but I just think there's enough on a developer's plate. That's my 2 cents on it.
No, and you're 100% right. The reality is different, where a lot of teams will manage their own servers and a lot of developers will be put on that like DevOps hat. But what happens in those situations, I've been a part of those kinds of teams, is that becomes like 50% of the developer's job. And it's not an efficient way to use a resource. And a developer is a developer, in my opinion. If you want the developer to be able to manage everything, they have to use a managed service like Vercel, like Netlify, that handles all that stuff for you, that you can call for support and that will do the CI/CD pipeline for you. So it's just a connection to your GitHub. That's it. That's all you have to really worry about from the beginning. There's a few little nitpicky little things here, there, but that's something a developer can handle, right? Like a Vercel or a Netlify, that's what it's built for. That's why they make a lot of money. And so that you can get kind of like your prototype, your V1, maybe even your V2 out, tested. As soon as you get to the point where you're like, okay, these costs are getting out of hand, the scaling is becoming more of a challenge, that's when you have to start thinking about a DevOps person. That will allow your developers to develop and your DevOps to DevOps. And that separation is super key if you want to maintain velocity on your team, like production velocity. If you have your developers maintaining your servers, you will lose 50% of their velocity because they will be either worried about the servers, so constantly checking on them, or when they're in the weeds and trying to figure out a server issue, they're not going to be able to figure out that feature. So you're hurting yourself if you're a team lead and causing your team to have to spin up Docker containers and servers rather than putting that on a managed service or hiring a DevOps person. Those are the options.
I 100% agree. Like if you're, and also like, just to kind of talk about, if you're like a solo person, that's like building your own projects and you just want exposure to the whole stack, including some DevOps stuff and hosting and whatever, and you don't want to use something like a Netlify that obfuscates a lot of this CI/CD stuff away from you, then, totally cool. Like go and check out CI/CD, go check all that stuff out, mess around with Docker, do what you got to do. Maybe try AWS if you want to try it. Watch those prices though, things like that. If you want to try it out, go try it out. But like Mike, you're 100% correct in that, like you're not getting the full velocity out of somebody because you're hiring somebody, for A, and then they know a little bit of B, and you're like, all right, go hardcore to B. And it's like, okay, well now I'm gonna like, do I have any training time? No. Oh, okay. And so I know there's like that whole, like, I don't know, old school adage of like, just toss him in there and he'll figure it out. It's like, yeah, he'll figure it out, but it's going to take a while. This isn't like just do it. Just be a doctor. Just figure out how the heart works. Open heart surgery tomorrow night. It's like, what? Like, what are we doing here? Like, like a doctor obfuscates a lot of health stuff for us, breaks it down, explains it to us non-medical professionals. Someone that works in servers can break down CI/CD, hosting, and all that stuff for the developers, so they don't have to worry about it. But I think that's it. That was the last one on the list. hopefully you enjoyed this. This is our, we keep saying, we believe it's our first 2-parter episode, which is pretty cool. And also remember, we also do the HTML All the Things podcast pre-show. We usually record on Tuesdays or Thursdays. And so whenever we are about to record, jump into a recording, we jump onto X and we do a pre-show. So go follow either me or Mike, because Mike tweets it out and he hosts it, and then I will usually repost it or whatever. So go check those out. The recordings are also on X as well. And if you want to support episodes like this, you can do so on Patreon. That's patreon.com/HTML all the things, just like these fine people did, including Tim from the Web Hacker on thewebhacker.com, Jason from Geek Life Radio via geekliferadio.com, Garrett Segal, Level Up Financial Planning via www.levelupfinancialplanning.com, and Magnus from YesWeb via yesweb.se. And we'd like to give a shout out to Michael LaRocca, a contributing author on HTMLallthethings.com. Michael is the author of Self-Taught, the X Generation blog at selftaughttxg.com. And last but not least, remember, we have our special code for up to 40% off. We've already described it all, but only the first 10 people can get it. So go and check it out in the show description, in the show notes on HTMLallthethings.com. Get up to 40% off on your Magic Mind. Go get productive. I was going to say something really cool, and then I just didn't have a word, and then I started saying it in panic. Anyway, go be productive. Get these productivity shots. Give them a go. It helps me out. Hopefully it'll help you out too. Feel free to leave a comment or a review in the platform that you are listening to this on. And this outro will sign us off.
You've been listening to HTML All the Things podcast. Web development, web design, and small business. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information from this show. And we hope you appreciate that we talk to you like human beings. And we hope you had some fun. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit us up on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon at HTML All the Things. And on Twitter at HTML Everything. Until next time, this is HTML All the Things, signing off.